going to solve the problems of poverty? What causes the problems of poverty? And doing something in a bigger way to solve those bigger long-term problems. And we have someone here tonight who started thinking about this as a teenager and wanted to solve some of the bigger problems, and she's here tonight to share her solution and her way of doing something bigger. So maybe some of us here will be inspired to do something in a bigger way, as well as helping people in their immediate needs. Andrea is now living in Guatemala and has been down there for 5 years because she started a nonprofit to fulfill the dreams of solving the bigger problems. And so I am greatly, greatly honored to introduce my beautiful daughter, Andrea Stachnik. Yeah!
One of the things I think a lot of people realize when they get here is they meet the families of the people who are going to receive these houses, and they realize that we're not really so different. These people wake up and they go to work and they come home and they worry about their kids and they talk about their families and maybe gossip a little bit too. But there's not that much that really separates us from them, that we're all the same. So I think this begs a really important question, and it's kind of an uncomfortable question for all of us to think about, which is, why are some people poor?
Because they don't have any money.
I have enough.
I think all of us here have seen that the answer to that question isn't as simple as poor people are lazy, or some people don't want to work, or that Mexicans are this way or that way, or any group of people is any particular way. It's a big, complicated problem. So it makes it hard to even start thinking about a question like that. Why are some people poor? 5 years ago, I moved to Guatemala, and I wanted to go and I wanted to see if I could figure out how to even start looking at that question. Guatemala is a country that was in a civil war between the 1950s until 1996. And they had a genocide that wiped out 250,000 people in their country. Today, they have one of the highest rates of malnutrition in the Western Hemisphere. They have one of the highest rates of domestic violence in the world, one of the highest rates of femicide in the world. Femicide is when you murder a woman. And they have just such immense, incredible suffering every day. And it makes you wonder, why? Why does this happen? Why does this exist? And what could we possibly ever do to address it, to deal with it, to even make a dent in that? So I just want to start by asking, what are some of the reasons that you think an individual family starts being poor? What are some of the things that you've seen? What's something that could happen to a family? Francesca?
Father leaves the house.
Father leaves a house, that's a really important one. So a single mother is facing a completely different situation. So a father leaving the house makes a huge impact on a family's ability to put food on the table, to get the kids in school, and get kids to doctor's appointments. What's another one? Yeah. Alcoholism, that's another one. Yeah, it's something that can destroy a family. Yeah. Lack of education, that's a huge, huge problem. And that's something that's really difficult. It's a really hard question to really address, because building a public education system is a huge, complicated issue. And even when you have a very rich country like the US, it's still always full of problems. War, yeah, that's another one. Government corruption, good. Victor? Illness, yeah, and illness.
Oh, yeah.
An illness in the family, or an illness in the country. You can have something like a plague, or you can have something like malaria. or something like cholera, which is something that's treatable in a lot of countries. But in poorer countries, it's something that can really become systemic and wipe out a population.
You lose your job.
Lose your job. It's the simplest one. It's the easiest way to be in poverty and not have money anymore is when you don't have a job.
Lack of opportunity.
Lack of opportunities, yeah, when there aren't any jobs for you to go find. When you live in a community where there just isn't much, or where you live in a community where there used to be an industry that got wiped out. Way in the back. Lack of general resources, yeah, lack of things like electricity, lack of running water when you don't have those kinds of infrastructural things when you don't have access to those sorts of things. So we've got a pretty big list here. There's a lot of things that can cause poverty for any one family, and there's a lot of things that can cause you to be in poverty to start with, and there's a lot of things that can make you, even if you are in a position of stability, that can put you into poverty down the road. So let's kind of narrow it down. Let's talk about how this could impact an individual family. So we're going to talk about a very typical family that you would find in Guatemala, which is what I'm familiar with. This would also be a very typical story here in Mexico. So let's talk about, let's imagine that we have a girl who's about 14, 15 years old. We'll call her Sophia. And she comes from a very poor family. So by the time that she starts growing up a little bit, her parents start to realize that boys are paying attention to her. And they can see that if she were to get married, that would be one less mouth for them to feed. So they see a boy who takes an interest in her, and Sophia gets married at about 14 years old. So maybe she's pregnant by the time that she's 15. So that means Sophia's not going to finish high school. That's not going to happen. Her husband, we'll call him Juan. Juan's not going to finish high school either. So they now have a child to raise. And they both have to go work every day. Minimum wage in Guatemala is about $1 an hour. So that means if Juan goes out and he works 6 or 7 days a week, full time, all the time, he can probably put a very basic 3 meals on the table. When you give birth when you're only 14 or 15 years old, then that presents there's a huge risk that you won't make it through the pregnancy. And there's a lot of risk that you'll continue having health problems throughout. So that's a lot of bills that Sophia's now probably going to have to pay. So this is a very common story in Guatemala. About 50% of girls in Guatemala will not finish high school. I maybe lost the next bit. So if Sophia and Juan, if their child that they had when they were teenagers, if that's a girl and she grows up, when she's about 14 years old, you can probably expect that Sophia and Juan are going to start looking around to see if there's a boy that's interested in marrying her. And that's not because they're bad people. It's not because it's a cultural difference. It's because they have no choices. It's because they don't have money to put food on the table, and they're looking for a better way for their children. So this is called a vicious cycle of poverty. And this is where you start to take into consideration all the things that all of you mentioned just a minute ago. Is you have one problem, you have one aspect of life, and it just starts a downward cycle where everything just gets worse and worse and compounds on each other. And I think that's at the end of the day, that's what keeps families trapped in poverty. So let's talk about kind of the opposite of a lot of the things that we just talked about a minute ago. What are some of the things that Sophia and Juan could do to make sure that their children don't wind up having the same life that they did? Yeah. Stay in school, yeah. Make sure that all of their kids stay in high school. That's a great one. What are some other things they could do? What could they do to prevent illness in their children? Immunize, or they could just take them to the doctor. Make sure that they get all their shots, that they have regular checkups, that they're seeing a doctor on a regular basis. There's not much they can do about war. There's not much they can do about lack of resources. There's no running water and electricity in their town. There's a lot that they can do in their individual family. there's a lot they can do in terms of nutrition, feeding their families to make sure that they have everything that they need. So let's look at that stay in school question. That's a big one. Staying in school is probably one of the easiest ways to make sure that your children have a better chance for their lives when they become adults. So if you have a child who just gets one extra year of elementary school, so that would be K through 8, when they're adults, their wages are going to be about between 10 and 20% higher. For high school, it's even better. If you have one extra year of high school, if you only finish up to your junior year rather than your sophomore year, you're going to get 15 to 25% more wages when you're an adult. And for women specifically, if you get to up to at least 7 years of education, that is 4 years later that you're going to marry in life, and that's 2 fewer children that you're going to have. So that's a woman who's waiting and making choices when she wants to get married, when she wants to have kids, rather than when she's 14 years old and making decisions because that's what people have suggested to her. So if you have, when you look at public education, it's a great thing to start with. You could say, let's just make free education for people who don't have access to it. But there's a lot more issues after that you still have to look at and you still have to consider. Because then what happens when one loses his job? What happens if Sophia gets sick? What happens if a flood comes in and wipes their house down? All these things still happen even when you have free education. And the number one response is probably going to be that the kids get taken out of school because they need to go out and work and they need to help support the family. So there's a second thing that I think is a really important component to breaking the cycles of poverty, and I think that's give Sophia a job. Give her a way that she can work, give her flexible income opportunities so that she can take care of her kids and she can still go out and earn money. There's a lot of studies that show that when a woman earns money, earns her own wages, that almost 100% of that money is going to go straight into paying for education. It's going to go straight into buying nutritious meals. It's going to pay for doctor's appointments, and it's going to go towards all the anti-poverty initiatives that we want to, just by allowing that woman to make the money. So I think that's a critical component to breaking those intergenerational cycles of poverty. And then I think the last thing that we need to look at is making sure that people have a clean roof over their head. Make sure that they have somewhere to sleep at night. If Sophia and Juan's children don't have somewhere with electricity and that's dry, where they can study at night, they're never going to be able to succeed at school. So I think education is definitely the key to figuring out how to break those cycles of poverty. But it's a bigger picture than that. In order to make education successful, you have to support the schools, but you also have to support the mothers. And you have to make sure that the mothers have all the tools and resources that they need to make sure that their children are successful. And that's it. Thank you.
What appropriations
The government of Guatemala or the government of Mexico? Government of Guatemala. The question is, what are the government programs that exist in Guatemala? The biggest one, I think in any country, but Guatemala is definitely one of them, is the public school system. It has its flaws. It's not perfect. But they've been able to bring the literacy level up from, I don't have the statistic off the top of my head, but it went from something like 40% of children being able to read to something like 70, which is a huge step. Behind that, the biggest initiative that they have is passing out bags of rice and bags of dried beans, and that especially goes out during election season. Those are the biggest government campaigns that I've heard of. Yeah, Francis. No, I kind of brushed over that. So Unmarked Streets is the nonprofit that I run in Guatemala, and what we do is we work with women, mothers in particular, but adult women and we try to train them in different entrepreneurial skills. So what we do is we invite the women to come into our office and learn one skill. So that could be jewelry making, that could be sewing, that could be quilting, and right away they can start earning money with that skill. So that way, from day one, they're putting food on the table for their kids. Once they master that skill and maybe a couple other ones, then we use that as a platform to teach them more generally about how to run a business. We teach them about sales, we teach them about communication, we teach them about quality control, pricing, all those kinds of general business skills so that they could, if they wanted to open a business, that would be an option for them. But it also just helps them to interview better if they're looking for work, because they have more confidence. They're not in a position where they're desperate to have the next paycheck come in right away. They can interview and they can speak with more confidence about what they can bring to the table because they value themselves and their work. Yeah?
How long would a typical woman mother stay for you to get that experience? How long might it take?
On average, women stay with our program between 6 and 12 months. It varies. Some people really like the program and they stay long term, but for the most part, we find that that women start having better job interviews after about 6 months, and not long after that, they'll find a job that is doing something that they enjoy.
Tell them about women unemployment in Guatemala. Women unemployment. How many women can actually work in Guatemala?
So the statistics on unemployment for women in Guatemala, I'm not exactly sure, but there's very few. Guatemala, much like Mexico, is very dependent on maquilas to generate employment. So that's the big factories that are exporting goods up to North America, primarily the United States. The problem with the maquilas is that in hiring, they almost exclusively hire men because they consider women a hassle, because women have children to care for, children get sick, and women get pregnant. So they would prefer to hire men, even when it's something like a sewing factory. They'll almost always hire men. The other problem with maquilas is that maquilas don't actually, in Guatemala, aren't required to pay the minimum wage. They have a separate lower minimum wage that they can pay as long as you're exporting to the United States. So it's not a great situation. So a lot of women wind up working in the informal economy. So that would be working as a maid, working, selling tortillas, things like that, working on the street, which is, they might be able to earn more money, but it'll be very risky because you don't know what you're going to get on any given day. There's, of course, no workers' protections if anything were to happen to you. Anything else? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. What she didn't tell you is that Unmarked Streets is something that she created and started on her own. This is not sponsored by big corporations. This is, we're out there working hard trying to support what she's doing. So thank you for big problem solving.
Any way we can help, though, how does it
How can they help you?
You can go to www.unmarkedstreets.org. We accept donations on our website. We also have an online store where you can buy all the jewelry, and soon will be purses and pillows and sewn items that the girls make.
She's also looking for some people in the States who might be willing to hold some events where we can show some of the products that the women are making and selling them. She is really looking for somebody that could do that. So come and talk to her if you have some other ideas on helping her out. Okay.